Back to the Green Ember, chapter 21, and it's called Swinging Death. Heather's scream joined with 100 others. Helmer ran, but he broke away from the terrified mother. The mother found her feet and fled, wailing, back up the hill, clasping her child. Helmer ran in an arc around the tree, slicing ropes as he went. The massive forms came swinging down in turn. In a moment, swooping down from 20 directions were what looked like giant birds. Heather gasped. Pickett jumped, almost went into the ground. It had taken only a few seconds, but Helmer had made a circuit around the tree. All his careful preparations were in motion. Sweeping down on him were the wooden birds of prey, which, free of their perches, now came into focus. Their talons, crude as they were set with razor-sharp knives. Many had beaks fixed with short swords which shot out in all directions. One of these monsters, coming directly at a rabbit, would be deadly to deal with. In his initial arc around the tree, Helmer had cut loose nearly 20 of them. They all swooped down at different heights and with varying speeds, so he now had to move with incredible agility to simply avoid them. The birds were made to be deadly. The only vulnerability appeared to be on their small heads of squash, melon, or pumpkin. His movements were further complicated by the various pumpkin-headed, wolf-like models, each of them featuring what Heather could now see were sharp blades from their sides. The terrifying gauntlet was set up to mimic an attack from birds of prey and wolves all at once, an attack from all directions. Here's a picture of the imaginary or made-up birds of prey right there. Immediately, he looked doomed. He sidestepped a swooping bird, only to turn as another swung straight for his head, blades pointing out like long, monstrous teeth. The crowd, for it now was a crowd gathered, cried out together in horror. Helmer ducked only just in time, then whirled and struck out with his blade to slice in half the pumpkin head of a model wolf. As the pumpkin split, he kicked the model over. One enemy down, only 30 more to go. They swarmed him as he dodged, dove, and struck out at them. He dodged back from a low swooping bird, receiving a nasty gash for his effort, and seemed to realize that 2 of the gliding attackers were emerging on him at once. He looked to be crushed, never mind the blades. Heather was sure this would be the end of him. A scream died in her throat, and the crowd's voices rose in a collective panic. Pickett's eyes widened, and he stepped forward a few more paces. At the last moment, as the 2 birds were almost on him, Helmer flicked backwards, his large feet barely missing the pulverizing blows. The 2 birds collided, breaking into pieces. This time, their shattered collision sent knives flying. Another dive, this time behind the body of a wooden wolf, saved him. Some shards flew over his head, and 3 speeding blades stuck fast in the wooden body he'd barely gotten behind. He stood, already panting, and looked wildly from side to side. The crowd gasped. Above him fell a massive bird, 10 sharp points poised at his head. He had no time to move out of the way, and 4 other birds, each in a unique rebounded flight, were surrounding him. He had, Heather believed, no escape. But again, at the last possible moment, he kicked out his feet, not in a jump, but to quickly give up his footing. He fell back in sync with the diving bird and landed hard on his back as the large wooden terror struck at him with its awful knives. But it came up just short. The rope it was tied to went taut, and the bird rebounded back up with a snap. The cords must have had some bounce to them, for they never died, but always sprang back up to fall or swing again with renewed pace. He lay there a moment, watching the sky above him swarm with foes. Nearby, Heather, Pickett, and Emma watched in terror. They heard a guard in green nearby talking anxiously to a farmer. Too many this time, Gabe, far too many. That'll be a right hard test for 5 well-trained soldiers. He'll be killed for sure. Heather was frightened. She had no desire to see such a thing, but felt powerless to do anything and too engrossed to look away. She cried out, "No!" Others were shouting as well, "Stay down, you fool!" But Heather could see that wouldn't happen. Helmer rose and with his powerful legs sprang into action once more. Immediately he was in grave peril. As he lunged at a swooping bird, another two were converging on his back. He leaped up and swung his sword at the gored head of the bird, sending it flying. Then he sliced the cord and it tumbled to the ground. The two birds from behind were nearly upon him. Heather closed her eyes and plugged her ears. She didn't want to see or hear the end of this barbaric madness. She could avoid seeing, but she couldn't block out the noise entirely. The groans and screams of the gathered crowd were displaced suddenly by a growing clamor that almost sounded like a cheer. She couldn't help it. She opened her eyes. Helmer had somehow evaded the two birds set out to destroy him. He was wounded, but fighting on. He was now in a more desperate spot with 9 of the birds converging on him from all sides at staggered times. He was backed against 2 of the model wolves. There was no escape. But she saw something else. Racing into the chaotic scene of careening blades came 3 figures. Lord Rake, Uncle Wilfred, and Smalls were diving into the battle. Now Heather was truly frightened. "No," Emma shouted, running after them. Heather barely knew what to do, but she grabbed Emma's arm, slowing her down as the crowd all pushed toward the wide circle around the maple where the deadly game was being played. As Heather ran toward the fast-forming crowd encircling the tree, she watched, half tripping as the scene unfolded. Lord Rake, running fast, soared into the air and clutched a rope, changing the direction of the attacking bird that he now stood on top of. In the same motion, just as he found his footing on the deadly bird, he cut the rope free, sending it tumbling out of the circle as he held on to the remainder of rope, gliding out in a wide arc. While Lord Rake swung wide of the converging birds, Smalls ran hard, shedding his hooded cloak. He never broke stride, running alongside Uncle Wilfred. With one hand, he unsheathed his blade, launching it from its sheath toward Uncle Wilfred, who caught it by its hilt. Uncle Wilfred now carried 2 drawn swords. Smalls finished his unsheathing pass, and in the same motion reached for an arrow from his quiver. Then he nooked and loosed with amazing speed, never stopping. The crowd broke out in fresh screams as they saw the arrow speed right for Helmer, but the arrow narrowly missed Helmer and embedded heavily in one of the wooden wolves that fenced Helmer in, setting it to gently rock. By the time the arrow had sunk, Smalls had sent 2 more flying. Finally, he knocked 3 more arrows and sent them all at once at the same target, a shout pouring out of his mouth with the tremendous display of strength. Heather was certain one would go astray and find Helmer, but none did. They added their force to the rocking wolf, and it toppled over. There was action all over. Uncle Wilfred was not idle. He had caught Small's sword in mid-air as he soared confidently into the fray. With a shout, he extended blades on both sides, slicing 2 of the ropes at once, sending the attached birds sailing into the ground. He turned and hurled his borrowed sword back to Smalls and finished by catching a low, swinging bird's rope and allowing it to send him speeding toward Helmer. He rode its momentum for just the right amount of time, then cut it loose, sending the bird to harmlessly crash to earth. Meanwhile, he let go of the rope and cut through the air, slicing 2 more ropes as he hurled past Helmer. Helmer himself appeared half mad with anger and joy. He'd only just dodged a deadly bird, slicing its rope as it passed, and made ready to face the remaining convergence of his brutal creatures. Even with the intervention of Rake, Wilfred, and Smalls, he seemed certain to fall. 3 of the few last birds were converging on him in such a way as to make his escape truly impossible. Uncle Wilfred had crashed into the crowd beyond, and Lord Rake swung back too soon, unable to recover in time. Helmer dodged, avoiding the 2 he could, while the 3rd swung down on him with unavoidable speed. It was large and fast, with blades all over, but Smalls was there. Leaping, he sailed through the air and presented his powerful feet to collide with the swooping bird. Blades stood out on the monster. Heather screamed. Smalls kicked the bird, sending it spinning away. He spun and smashed into the ground. She saw that he was cut, but she couldn't see how badly. Helmer's eyes were wide as he was dragged out of the circle over the fallen arrow-riddled wooden wolf. He looked shocked, perhaps from being saved from certain death, but Heather thought there was more. His shocked expression was tinged with fresh shame. Then the crowd swelled in a chorus of terrified screams once more. Heather looked and saw to her terror that as Smalls lay wounded on the ground, the bird he'd knocked away was rebounding and crashing down on him with amazing speed. Now it was Smalls who looked up in a haze to see certain death descending on him. That's the end, buddy, of this chapter.